Harold always thought he knew how life worked. He lived it honestly. He worked, raised his son, saved money for retirement, and dreamed of a quiet old age in his own home. But life is a tricky thing. It can build up a sense of stability for years and then destroy it all in one fell swoop. Tonight was an ordinary evening. Harold was sitting in his favorite armchair, sipping whiskey and looking through old photo albums. He loved these moments. There was something nostalgic and warm about them. Here he was with Marion, his ex-wife, still young and in love. Here is their son Michael as a child, a boy with unruly curls who laughed all the time. Everything was fine. Or at least he thought so. Can we do a DNA test? Harold looked up from his sketchbook and looked at his friend Frank. The latter was sitting across from him, lounging on the couch, jokingly twirling a package of ancestry tests in his hands. What? Why? Harold smiled, although the idea seemed a bit strange to him. I'm just curious. Imagine if you have some noble blood in you, or if you're half Irish. Frank laughed. Harold rolled his eyes, but then picked up at the test. He had heard of these people finding out that their ancestors had lived in unexpected places or finding distant relatives. He wasn't too interested, but why not? All right, damn it, I'll do it. What do you want? Frank handed him the instructions. It was simple to take a saliva sample, fill out a form, and send it to the lab. They promised to send the results in a few weeks. We'll see if you're a real American, or maybe you have some Viking blood in you. Frank teased him. Harold just smiled. He never imagined that this innocent prank would ruin his life. Harold had been a pensioner for 10 years. He was used to this measured life: morning coffee, a walk in the park, newspapers, whiskey before bed. He was pleased to feel that he had full control over his life. Before, everything was more complicated. Although working on a construction site sucked all his energy, constant quarrels with his wife, alone for a house, raising his son, all this was exhausting. But he got through it. His son Michael grew up, became successful, built his own company, and bought a big house. Harold was proud of him. Marion left him many years ago. She got tired, found someone else. Well, it happens. Although he did not hold a grudge, although it was painful at the time. The most important thing is that he still has Michael. Time heals. He let go of the past. At least he thought so. A week passed, then another. Harold forgot about the test. Adorma went on with his life as usual. One morning, when he took out his bills and advertising brochures from the mailbox, he noticed a thin envelope. The name of the laboratory was written on it. Oh, the results. He said to himself and opened the envelope. He expected to see something like 50% German blood, 25% British blood. Nothing special. But as he skimmed the lines, he suddenly noticed something strange. He read it again. Then again. His face changed and his heart began to race. Harold felt his hands shaking. The whole world around him seemed to blur. No match to his immediate family. His DNA didn't match Michael's. Harold couldn't believe it. It was some kind of mistake. It couldn't be. He rushed to the computer, went to the laboratory's website, entered the test code. He waited for the results to be downloaded. Everything was the same. He was not Michael's biological father. Harold leaned back in his chair. The whiskey he had just poured into his glass remained untouched. Was this a joke? How could this be possible? Michael, his son. He held him in his arms, took him to school, raised him, was proud of him. All of this. A lie? Harold tried to calm himself. He couldn't just believe it. The lab could have made a mistake. He muttered under his breath. But something inside him told him no, it wasn't a mistake. Memories began to surface in his head. Strange moments that seemed insignificant at the time. In a long time ago, Marion reacted strangely when he said that Michael was very much like him. She had once joked that genetics is a strange thing. His heart sank. Harold had always thought that the worst of his life was over, but that nothing could break him. But now he realized that it was just beginning. Harold sat in his chair, staring at the printed DNA test results. It was as if the world had stopped. His mind refused to accept this information. He was not Michael's biological father. His legs felt like cotton wool and his mind raced. This is a mistake. Yes, there must be a mistake! They must have gotten it wrong. He stood up abruptly, almost knocking over his whiskey glass, and grabbed his phone. His fingers trembled as he searched for the lab's number. "Hello, this is the DNA lab. How can we help you?" "Anna," came the friendly voice over the speaker. "Yes, this is, Harold Fisher. I've received your test results, and, I think there's been a mistake. Could you please give me your unique test code?" The operator asked politely. Harold dictated a long string of numbers, holding the phone with both hands to keep from dropping it from his nerves. Thank you. Just a moment." Harold could hear her typing something on the keyboard. It was only a few seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. "And Mr. Fisher, we've checked the data. The test was performed without error, and the samples were tested twice. The results are accurate." My heart was pounding in my chest as if someone had clamped it in a vice. "Are you sure?" he mumbled. "Absolutely. You can order a second test if you want, but our procedures guarantee an accuracy rate of over 99%. Harold was silent. What can you say in this situation? "Thank you." He squeezed out and hung up the phone. He felt the world around him falling apart. Harold sank back into his chair and stared at the phone. He needed to talk to someone. But with whom? Marion. He hadn't spoken to her in years, except for brief greetings on holidays. After the divorce, they had only talked when it was necessary. But now, he found her number in his contacts. His finger hovered over the call button. What will she say? What if she brushes it off? What if she admits it? Before he could think it through, his finger pressed the screen on its own. A beep. 2, 3. Hello. Her voice hadn't changed much. The same slightly hoarse timbre, although the years had added severity. "Or it's Harold." He tried to sound calm, but his voice betrayed him. "Oh, I haven't heard from you in a long time. Is everything okay?" Harold didn't beat around the bush, and I did a DNA test, and you know what? Michael is not my son. A silence fell on the other end of the line. "Marion." Her voice trembled. He realized it before she said it out loud. "Is it true?" His voice was almost a whisper. "Harold, I didn't want you to find out this way." He felt his world spin. "God damn it, Marion!" Harold stood up, his voice trembling with anger. "You let me raise a child who? He's still your son," she whispered. "Oh no, he is not my son." Harold could barely contain himself. "Please don't do this." Her voice trembled. I didn't mean it. It happened a long time ago. It was a mistake." "A mistake!" He exhaled loudly. I raised him. I denied myself everything. I paid for his education. I was there for him. I thought he was a part of me, and you just... He was unable to finish. I didn't plan it. Marion finally spoke. It was a one-time thing, and I was confused, lonely. And then I realized I was pregnant. Why didn't you say anything? Because I loved you. Because I knew you were the best father anyone could have. Harold put his hands over his face. Damn. No, he didn't know what was worsing, that he'd been lied to his whole life, or that she hadn't even seen fit to tell him the truth. "Does Michael know?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "No." Well, now he will," Harold said coldly. "Or please don't do this." He didn't answer. He hung up the phone. He suddenly realized that he had no idea what to do next. Harold sat in his living room, staring at an old family photo. And it was of him, Marion, and little Michael, a smiling boy with what he always thought were his eyes. It had always made him feel warm in his chest. And now, he couldn't even look at it without being disgusted. Michael was not his son. He had been living a lie for 50 years. Harold looked at the phone again. His hand twitched nervously over the screen. He wanted to call Michael, to tell him the truth, to pour out everything that had been pent up, but something was stopping him. What if Michael was innocent? What if he didn't know either? And then what would change? Harold stood up, walked over to the bar, and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He drank it down without tasting it. His brain was working at full capacity. If Michael didn't know anything, was it worth telling him? On the one hand, it was his truth, his life that Marion had stolen from him. He had the right to know. Amara, on the other hand. What difference would it make? Michael is a grown man. He has his own family, children, grandchildren. He has always loved him as a father. What if I told him the truth? Would it ruin their whole life? Harold looked at the phone again. He didn't want to hear Marion's voice anymore, but it seemed he would have to. He dialed her number. Harold. Her voice was quiet, almost broken. I want to hear the truth, he said coldly. I've already told you everything. No, you've told me what's convenient for you. Who is he? Silence. Who, Marion? It doesn't matter. Or it does to me. Silence again. Dixon, she whispered. Harold's jaw clenched. Tom Dixon, once his best friend. A pain shot through his body as if he'd been punched in the stomach. You slept with my best friend. It was just once. Her voice broke. I didn't know how to tell you. He laughed. Bitterly, without joy. Oh, of course you did. It was easier to make me raise someone else's child. Marion was silent. Did he know? I never told him. That was another blow. Tom Dixon died a few years ago. He never knew he had a son. Harold felt the phone vibrate in his hand. Michael's number came up on the screen. Does he feel anything? He took a deep breath. He dropped the call. It wasn't time yet. He needed to decide what to do next. Harold set the glass on the table and stared at the wall. Does he have the right to destroy Michael's life with the truth? Or is it just his selfishness? What was more important, the truth or the love that had been between them all these years? Harold woke up early. He had been up most of the night. The whiskey didn't help. The thoughts of a lie that had lasted for half a century were haunting him. He decided that he was done sitting around. He needed to find out everything. Harold opened the closet and pulled out a large box. Inside were dozens of yellowed photographs, postcards, and old documents. He hadn't taken them out in years. He began to look through the pictures. Here he was with Marion on their wedding day. Here she is holding the baby, Michael. He looked closely at the photos. Were there any signs? Was there a clue that he hadn't noticed? His hands trembled when he found the letter. The letter was without an envelope. It was handwritten. It was dated more than 50 years ago. Marion, I can't stop thinking about that night. I know it was a mistake, but I can't help but imagine what would have happened if things had turned out differently. I hope Harold doesn't suspect anything. Yours, Tom. Harold crumpled the paper. He found it hard to breathe. Tom knew. Harold remembered that Tom had a brother, George Dixon. They hadn't spoken in years, but George definitely knew more. He opened his laptop and started searching. The address was old, but it was worth a try. Harold pulled up to a small house in the suburbs. His heart was pounding in his chest. George opened the door, graying with deep wrinkles, but it was easy to recognize him. Harold. How many years has it been? He did not hide his surprise. We need to talk. Harold's voice was dry. George invited him inside. It's about my brother, isn't it? Did you know that Michael is his son? Harold to George sighed and rubbed his face. Yes, Harold clenched his fists. And you didn't tell me. It was none of my business, George answered quietly, but Tom suspected. He couldn't be sure, but he felt something. Harold gritted his teeth. Why didn't he do anything? Because you were his friend. And because he was afraid of losing everything. Harold came home broken. He had found out the truth. But now what? Should he tell Michael? Or would it only ruin their lives? Harold sat in his car, parked outside Michael's house. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers were white. He had been sitting there staring at the door for 5 minutes. His whole life had come down to this moment. He had rehearsed hundreds of conversation options in his head, but none of them seemed right. How do you tell someone you've raised for half a century that they are nothing to you? Harold took a deep breath and got out of the car. His legs were heavy, as if he had been carrying the weight of these 50 years. He knocked on the door. A few seconds later it opened, and Michael appeared on the threshold. A sincere smile lit up his face. "Dad, come in." Harold felt his heart clench. That word, Dad. For the first time, he thought maybe he didn't want to hear the truth. The living room was cozy. Michael put cups of coffee on the table. "What's up, Dad?" Did something happen? Harold took a sip of the hot drink, trying to collect his thoughts. "Michael, we need to talk." His son looked up at him in surprise. "Haro AI, is it something serious?" Harold clutched up so tightly that it almost cracked, or I did a DNA test. Michael smiled. "Oh, wow, what did it say? You must be half Scottish or something." "No, it's not that." Harold paused. The test showed that we're not. That I'm not your father." Michael froze as if he hadn't realized. "Oh, what? I'm sorry, son." Michael set his cup down. "Are you kidding me?" Harold shook his head. I thought it was a mistake, too. But I checked twice." The room fell silent for a moment. "Mom," Michael finally said. "Did she know?" Harold nodded. Michael got up and walked around the room. His face burned with anger. "And Ashley kept this a secret all her life. She said she made a mistake." "Oh, a mistake." Michael turned around sharply. 50 years of lying is not a mistake, Dad." Harold felt his heart pounding. "I only found out a few days ago." Michael sat down across from him, stunned. "What do you want me to do now?" "You want me to stop calling you Dad?" Harold lowered his head. "I don't know." They were silent for a few minutes. Finally Michael spoke. "You're still my father to me. But how do we live with the fact that our whole life is a lie?" Harold had no answer. He could feel their lives coming apart at the seams. Harold could not sleep. He turned from side to side, staring into the darkness of the bedroom. His thoughts were swirling, unable to rest. His son was not his son. His wife had lied. Half a century of life had been built on deception. But now he knew the truth. What was next? The next morning the phone rang as soon as Harold took his first sip of coffee. "Dad." Michael's voice was firm. "We need to talk to Mom." Harold flinched. "Are you sure about this?" You want to just leave it alone?" "I could go on as if nothing had happened." Harold sighed. "Of course not." "Then let's meet." "She has to answer." An hour later, Harold stood at the familiar door. His ex-wife, Margaret, was not expecting this visit. "Oh, Harold." "Michael, is something wrong?" Michael immediately went on the offensive. "Mom, we know everything." Margaret's face changed dramatically. "What? No. What, I did a DNA test, Mom?" Michael replied coldly. Margaret flinched. "You're joking." Harold caught her eye. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Margaret gripped the edge of the table. I didn't want to hurt you." Michael laughed, but it was bitter. You didn't mean to hurt me." "Is that why you lied to me for 50 years? Margaret lowered her head. "It was a long time ago, I was in love with another man." Harold felt his heart clench. "And who was he?" Margaret pressed her lips together, then whispered, "He's dead." Michael looked up sharply. "What do you mean, dead?" Margaret shuddered. "He was killed in a car accident before you were born." "I didn't want you to grow up without a father." Harold shook his head. "So you just replaced him with me." Margaret looked him straight in the eye. "You were a good husband and a good father, but not a real one." Her lips trembled. "Harold, I was afraid of losing everything." Michael jumped to his feet. "I can't believe this." I need to think. He ran out of the house, leaving his parents alone. Margaret lowered her head. "You're going to lose him." Harold went to the door. "It was you who lost us 50 years ago." Harold sat in the empty apartment, staring into a glass of whiskey. The silence was deafening. He had spent 50 years living a lie, and now he was alone. Michael didn't answer the phone. His ex-wife had destroyed everything he thought was true. He replayed the events of the last few days over and over in his mind. His son was not his. But he had raised him, loved him, spent sleepless nights at his crib. a mom didn't that make him a real father? Harold wanted to find an answer, but the only answer was bitter silence. Around this time, Michael was sitting in his car in front of his mother's house when he was about to press the doorbell, but his hand was in the air. He was afraid. Finally, he forced himself to go in. Margaret opened the door, her face tired and pale. You came. I want to know more," Michael said without going inside. Margaret took a deep breath. His name was Thomas. We were dating before I met Harold. Why did you stay with your father? She shuddered. Thomas died in an accident. I found out I was pregnant after that. I was lonely, scared. And then Harold came along. He was kind and reliable. I knew he would be a good father. Michael clenched his fists. Did he know? Margaret shook her head. I couldn't risk it. You couldn't risk it. Michael's voice trembled. What about me? What about him? Margaret closed her eyes. It was wrong, but I loved you both. Harold was still sitting in his apartment when the phone rang. Hi reached for the receiver sluggishly. Hello, it's me, Michael. Harold's heart sank. Son, we need to talk. Tomorrow at the corner cafe. Okay, Harold replied, afraid to breathe. The next day, Harold came to the cafe earlier than agreed. He nervously spun his cup of coffee until he finally saw Michael walk in. His son sat down across from him, was silent for a long time, and then spoke. Mom told me about Thomas. Harold sighed. And how are you? Michael shook his head. I don't know. But I do know this. You are my father. Harold looked up. Michael? You raised me. You taught me to ride a bike, took me to school, supported me when I first fell in love. You were always there. It's more important than DNA. Harold's eyes grew moist. I thought I'd lost you. Or I thought so too. They sat in silence, but this time the silence was peaceful. Harold was returning home after meeting Michael, and he had a strange feeling in his heart. Relief, pain, anger, everything was mixed in a chaos that did not give him peace. Michael said he was still his father. But was that enough to forget everything that had happened? Harold stopped at the door, ran his hand over his face, and sighed heavily. The apartment was empty and quiet. He had once considered this place his home, but now it reminded him only of his losses. His eyes fell on an old family album. He opened it and saw photos of little Michael, family holidays, travels, and his happy face everywhere. Can this be forgiven? He did not know. The next morning, the phone vibrated. Harold looked at the screen, Margaret. He hesitated for a long time, but finally answered. What do you want? We need to talk, Harold. Her voice was quiet, full of anxiety. Go ahead. No, not on the phone. Please, meet with me. He almost refused. Almost hung up the phone. But something made him agree. Margaret was waiting for him in the park, on the old bench where they used to sit holding hands. Harold approached, crossed his arms over his chest. Well, tell me. She took a deep breath. But I know what I did was terrible. But I really loved you, Harold. He laughed bitterly, resentfully. Loved me. So much that you lied for half a century. I was afraid I was going to lose you. You have lost me, Margaret. She flinched, but did not look away. You may hate me, but you must remember that we had a wonderful life together. Harold clenched his fists. I lived a life of lies, but it was real. The silence lingered. Harold could feel his anger changing. To what? Desolation, confusion. Harold could have done many things. He could tell everyone how lying she was. He could have gone to court to get her to pay him back some of the money he spent on Michael. He could curse her for the rest of his life. But what good would that do him? He looked at Margaret. She was no longer the woman he loved. She had become a stranger. Harold stood up slowly. I will not take revenge on you, Margaret, but I cannot forgive you. Her eyes filled with tears. I understand. He turned and left. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly free. Harold walked down the street, slowly, hunched over, as if the invisible weight of all those years of living a lie was hanging on his shoulders. The sun was setting, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. He felt that he was on the threshold of a new life, but was he ready to take a step forward? His choice was simply forget and move on, or let his anger control him. In his mind, he knew that revenge would not change anything. But his heart ached with pain. That night he received a message from Michael. "Dad, we need to talk." "It's important." Harold looked at the screen for a long time before answering. "Okay, tomorrow morning at the corner cafe." The next day, he was sitting at a table, warming his palms on a cup of coffee. Michael came quickly, looking confused and tense. "Allah, thank you for agreeing to meet with me," my son said, sitting down across from me. "Say what you want." Michael ran his hand over his face. I know this is hard for you, but you're still my father." Harold raised his head sharply. "I am. Then why only finding out now?" Michael looked down. "I'm a victim of that lie too." Harold looked at him, trying to understand. And he had been so angry for so long that he hadn't even thought about how it had affected Michael. "I don't want to lose you, Dad," his son added quietly. Harold felt something inside him shrink. Margaret also tried to get back into his life. She wrote messages, made phone calls, but Harold ignored her. One day she showed up at his door. "You have to listen to me," she said firmly. Harold wanted to slam the door, but something stopped him. He was tired of hate. "Just tell me." She nervously clenched her hands. "I know I ruined our lives, but I want to make it up to you." Harold laughed dryly without joy, and in a tone. "How do you mean? Will you take me back 50 years? "No, but I want us to find a way to live through it." Harold looked at her long and silently. "I don't know who you are anymore, Margaret." She sighed, lowered her head. But I'm not asking you to take me back. But you have a right to the truth." He nodded. "Only if it's all of it." That night Harold couldn't sleep. He thought about everything that had happened. He could have cut all ties, erased them both from his life. But then what? He would be left alone, full of anger that would consume him from the inside. Is it worth holding on to the past if it only destroys you? Harold stood by an old oak tree in the city park. This oak had been there since his youth, when he had taken Margaret on a date. Now it stood alone, as if it were a witness to all his lost years. Michael approached silently, stopping next to it. "I don't know how to fix this," he finally said. It's impossible," Harold replied. "You can't turn back time." They were silent for a long time, listening to the wind rustling in the branches. Will you ever forgive her?" Michael asked. "I don't know," Harold sighed. "What about me?" Harold looked at him. "You are not to blame." Michael breathed a sigh of relief. "I just want you to know that I'm grateful to you for everything." The old man nodded, not trusting his voice. The next day Harold received another letter. It was from Margaret. If you don't want to talk, I'll accept that. But you should know that I am sorry. Not because of the exposure, but because of the years of lies. I can't change the past, but if you let me, I can be there for you in the future." He read the letter several times. Once upon a time, he would have torn it up and thrown it away. But now, he just put it in a drawer. Days passed. The anger and pain did not disappear, but they became less acute. One morning, Harold suddenly dialed the phone. "Margaret." She held her breath. "Yes," he paused. "Perhaps we can talk." Silence. "And thank you. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe." What to do with the truth that changes nothing, but destroys everything? How do you live with the fact that you have been deceived for half a century? Let us know what you think about this story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, there are many more stories to come.